Hey, welcome back. This is the second to last week, I suppose, in the course. So this is going to be the last new material. So there's this somewhat longish article from Sandra Harding. Sometimes it's a bit technical, but it's not too bad. Anyways, we're going to go through it and I'll bring out the main points. And we're going to very briefly attach to that some considerations on the idea of epistemic injustice from that fairly short piece from Rachel McKenna. What we're going to do next week, the last week basically, is bring that together both with Rorty but also with the piece from Arthur Murphy that we had at the very beginning of the course. So that's for next week. So this is the last new material basically. So I'm going to talk about Harding first basically. Oops, let me click something here. There we go. As you'll see, she's a philosopher of science, so she's concerned with science in particular, so that's fine for our purposes. We're thinking about objectivity. If there's going to be objective knowledge anywhere, it's going to be in the field of science. She's going to raise some questions and problems basically about that. So it's going to be in this sense that she's like Rorty, right? She's actually shares that kind of skeptical view. It's actually fairly widespread nowadays, right? It's stemming back from Hume, that there's something whatever, fishy, say, or there is a problem when we think in somewhat naive terms about the ideal of objectivity understood as some kind of perfectly unbiased perspective. Although she's going to add a very interesting point here. Again, this isn't really so much her alone. This is a widely held view in the 20th century when we're talking about empirical science. Basically, there's always this fact, there's always this situation where any scientific theory is underdetermined by the available evidence. That is to say, whatever data, observations, and so on that we have to base our empirical claims upon, it's always possible in principle to draw different conclusions. In principle, any number of conclusions could always be drawn. Different theories are always consistent with the data. That doesn't mean they're all equally believable or credible, by no means. Typically, the way science goes is that after a while, some of those views get weeded out. Some of them are just outliers, only held by quacks, say, and that largely a certain consensus emerges. But it never changes the underlying fact that there are always different ways to account for the data. There's always, as she puts here, a kind of slack there. That in and of itself is not a problem. That's just how it is. She's just going to be worried that this is going to lead to a different kind of problem, that certain kinds of values and so on, ideas, negative ones in particular, might be able to kind of contaminate the process and get in there. So a major thing for Harding here that she doesn't spend a ton of time on, but it's good to know where she's coming from, is that she has a fairly critical view of contemporary society, ours or others similar across the world, basically thinking that there are significant social problems of inequality and injustice and discrimination. These are real, they still exist. She's coming at this in particular from a feminist point of view, where she's thinking about those along lines of gender. She also, thinks it applies no less to questions about race and racism and other forms, other, major, significant, systemic problems like that. Basically, that's sort of where she's coming from and the worries that she has with regard to objectivity. So basically, we can think, in contrast to someone like Rorty, right? Basically, other people who share a skeptical view about the ideal of objectivity. People like Rorty just basically junk it, right? They just throw it away and basically say, well, all we have now is, say, relativism, or for Rorty, we might call it solidarity. But Harding, and I think this is a good point, isn't satisfied with that. That seems like a false dichotomy, right? It seems like we're being forced to choose between two things, neither of which is very good, and we might be able to think of a better third alternative. So that's what she wants to do, is try to rethink objectivity. It was basically just misguided, the original ideal. It's just not going to work out, but there's still something important to it. It has a certain value. When we think about knowledge or claims as being objective, that does mean something. And she just wants to try to unpack what that is so we don't have to throw it away. basically thinks it's just too valuable to throw away. We know that even if no claim is, say, perfectly objective, some are better than others, and that's what we want to try to capture. What would it mean for certain claims to be better or stronger, or why we should take some more seriously than others? So she's going to talk about this, basically noting, look, people do debate this, and she basically thinks that it really varies according to kind of who one is and where one stands in a given society, what people are going to think about objectivity. So that connects with her view, basically, of most contemporary societies being characterized by division and conflict of some kind. So the idea of objectivity is contested. That means people will disagree about it, have different ideas. And she even says it's essentially contested, meaning she doesn't necessarily think that contestation or disagreements about what it means is ever going to go away. Right? So she doesn't necessarily think what she has to say is going to be agreed to by everybody, but she's hoping more people than not will actually agree with her. So as we'll see later, there's a real distinct kind of democratic sense to what she wants to say here. Her critique of objectivity, though, centers on this idea of neutrality, basically. She thinks that people generally think objectivity and neutrality are more or less the same thing, but in her view, this doesn't quite make sense. And that's just because, and you may agree, if it's true that, say, contemporary society is itself not neutral, there are problems of unfairness or inequality and injustice, right? That is to say, if things aren't neutral to begin with, then it doesn't quite make sense to sort of focus on neutrality. That's kind of to be complicit with a certain problem, right? I always have this image, the metaphor of a level playing field. If you were at a football game and the field was literally on the side of a hill, one team had to go up and the other was going down, and you think that's obviously unfair. And if the referees didn't pay any attention to that, if the referees were very good at calling the fouls and penalties and so on, they did all that perfectly fairly, perfectly neutrally, but were oblivious to the fact that one team had to play uphill and the other had the advantage of playing down, you would think there was a problem. That's basically what she's saying here about society, more or less, right? It's already not a level playing field. So if we sort of focus just on neutrality, we're kind of complicit with that. So that's the meaning of this significant quote here. Maximizing objectivity is not identical to maximizing neutrality. Maybe in some long-term ideal sense, but in the here and now, right, we don't want to just focus on neutrality because there are sort of biases already kind of in play, and those are what we want to try to bring to our attention so that we can correct for them. That's basically going to be her problem, or the problem she wants to bring to our attention, right? That if it's true that we still live in a society where there are very negative values or disvalues associated with, say, sexism and racism that permeate the atmosphere of society, there's no reason to assume those don't affect the work of scientists. Scientists are just humans like the rest of us. This kind of, say, implicit bias, sometimes people talk about it like that, can certainly affect what they do in science. Right? It can kind of get taken up into the very process of producing scientific knowledge. Right? This is what she wants, and she thinks science in general hasn't paid any attention to this problem. So she thinks science does try to stop, other kinds of biases or conflicts of interest. Basically, if some scientist is paid off by a pharmaceutical company, that's kind of obvious. Science is pretty good at picking that out. But in this more systemic way, she thinks, it's a much bigger worry because it flies under the radar. Basically, the way science is done just as a human social practice can be affected just as much as anything else by these negative values. And if we're not, self-consciously attentive to it, we could just miss it altogether and then take the results of science as being objective when in fact they're completely biased. So notice here, it's a very significant point here when she says science is ethnoscience. In her mind, this is a terribly damning thing to say. That is exactly what science does not want to be. It's trying to be truly objective, and she's just pointing out that to the extent that science does not take deliberate steps to make sure that these kinds of values don't affect what it's doing and the conclusions that it draws, then it's basically just reflecting some of the built-in cultural biases of the society that it's taking place in. Some of those may not be necessarily good or bad, but she's just focusing on the fact that, well, actually, some of them are very bad, right? And if these are sort of taken up into and kind of woven into the conclusions that science draws, and this is a particularly bad thing. So she wants science not to be ethnoscience. Now, anyways, I just flagged this because it's a very useful point of contrast with Rorty, who would, of course, he would actually say, yes, science should be ethnoscience, right? We're supposed to gear the pursuit of knowledge to the well-being of our community. That would be, to see things by our own lights in a solidarity kind of way. Whereas basically Harding here is really trying to steer away from that and push us to kind of sort of redeem the original kind of deeper intentions of science. In this regard, she's a lot like Dolbach. She has that kind of optimism about what science can do in terms of a socially progressive role that it can play. She just now recognizes, in a way Dolbach didn't way back, that the ideal of objectivity really needs to be rethought. So she's going to go on. So the idea of weak objectivity is basically just our ordinary sense where we fail to do what she's talking about here, right? Where we only pick out the more limited or individual biases that can affect science and fail to notice these more kind of systemic forms that it can take. And this can lead then to a situation where we have what we think, is objective knowledge, but is in fact no such thing. And she just thinks this can have the terrible implication of just reinforcing all those forms of bias, all those forms of inequality, when you have science itself, which is taken so seriously, and its conclusions are taken to be objective, if that goes and then informs, say, social policies or whatever, it can just sort of reinforce the problem, and that's really the worst thing. So we just need to rethink this, basically. I'm never in the picture here. We need to rethink this ideal of objectivity so that we can try to address this problem and steer things in the right direction. Here's just a quick, funny little example. It's not very funny at all, but it has to do with ethnobotany. It's something you may possibly have never heard of, and that's why it's a useful example. We don't have any preconceptions about it. It's simply like this. Somebody did a study of some ethnobotanical research. So ethnobotany is where people go and study humans' relationship with plants. It's kind of a big deal because pharmaceutical companies are always very interested in what various indigenous populations around the world know about their local plant life, because some of it's very useful for medicine. Anyway, the point was, lots of work was done, some results are published, it's taken as objective knowledge, and then this person comes along and studies how it was gained, how it was achieved, the knowledge and so on, and notices a certain problem, which when you boil it down is quite simply that in a great many cases, the researchers, when they go to these communities and they talk to people, well, they kind of talk selectively. In so many cases, they only talk to men. There could be any number of reasons for this, but one consistent point is that, well, it was always thought to be okay. It was always thought that this was not a methodological problem, or this was not going to somehow undermine their results. But as it turns out, it actually did. They had very faulty knowledge because in most of those cases, quite a bit of the relevant ethnobotanical know-how was something women knew. So anyway, the point here is just a very clear kind of example for what we're going to see with Harding is how basically a faulty conception of objectivity, right? When we're thinking that there's some ideal perspective that we could get, as opposed to thinking that there isn't. Hang on a second. I mean, right. So what we see in this example is just that there can be certain biases in the researchers which operate to exclude from their consideration certain sources of experience, basically, which would lead to improved results. Not necessarily purely objective, but this is basically the thought that Harding is going to be developing, right? The way these biases work in particular, and especially, is to basically exclude from our consideration certain sources of experience, certain relevant perspectives, which would lead to a more inclusive and comprehensive view overall. I'll continue in a moment.